That brings us to a way that we've been working on, some of us, on education, epidemics, and action. Why epidemics? You will know very soon. My friend Ron Laporte is here. He's founder of what we call the Super Course. Now, the Super Course is basically a series of PowerPoint lectures that are made available for free on the internet, available to anybody around the world, and it's governed by a community of practice, and we create these DVDs and sell them to people for free. We give them send them to people in deans, in medical schools around the world, and one of WHO is here. WHO has helped send them all over the world. But these are to get them in DVD form, but they are online in 34 servers, 3,600 lectures used by 60,000 teachers to reach 1 million students in 175 countries for free. And what are we planning to do? Well, that was epidemiology. We want to expand it, not just to deliver the written material. We want to expand it, and Ron Laporte and Gil Oman and Vin Cerf, who's not here with us, but Gil and Ron are here, and myself, are committed to try to expand it to other areas, including medicine, engineering, IT, environment, and agriculture. So we want to build communities of practice, which we hope will include you, and get them to contribute in what we're doing. Now, mind you, a large part of that contribution is work that's already being done, because all of the distinguished scientists here are using PowerPoint lectures anyway. So what we want is to get copies of your lectures to be allowed to be given for free, to be utilized by people, and we will be launching some spectacular new functionalities to help you use it and contribute to it. So do come and listen to the session on the Super Course. Theme 2 on food, agriculture, and natural resources is really addressing the need for us to challenge what's happening in global agriculture. And I was very happy to be with Dr. Adel Beltagi and others in Montpellier a few days ago, actually 2 weeks ago to be precise. We have an unfair, unsustainable system of agriculture in the world today. I mean, that's to make it simple and straight. How? Well, we know the numbers, we know the challenges. So the question is, how do we transform agricultural research into development to respond to these challenges? That was the theme of Montpellier. And the first of these is to recognize what went wrong. What went wrong with the food price crisis of 2 years ago? It was a devastating experience. Well, it exposed the weakness and fragility of the current world system. First of all, it distorted trade that we know of, that we worry about in terms of subsidies, and this cartoon done by my friend Zapiro of South Africa, I think is very indicative how third world farmers are expected to compete with highly subsidized, highly mechanized first world farmers. Let the competition begin? Well, not quite fair. But shortfalls in production, drought in Australia and elsewhere, low global food stocks against a rising demand for food and feed, with prices spiked. Now, countries slapped on export bans, and that immediately exacerbated the situation and has now fed a paranoia in importing countries that, should this be repeated, there is no guarantee that even if we are willing to put up the money, we will be able to find the food we need. And thus, contrary to trying to optimize global production, people are moving back towards notions of self-sufficiency rather than being able to think differently about food security. There's a huge increase in demand for animal proteins due to high increases in incomes in many parts of the world, especially China. And that will result in needs for feed, because most animals today, animal proteins, are produced by animal feed through farming. And that puts a special weight on maize or corn. And we add to that that there was a very unfortunate switching to biofuels with an emphasis on using corn, which also helped the spike of food prices that occurred. And that led to, as we called them initially in the United States, the tortilla riots in Mexico in 2007, And here in Egypt, we had our own echoes of that at the time, and that's impacting on our policy to this day. My friends, it is wrong to burn the food of the poor to drive the cars of the rich. It is simply wrong. We need a second generation of biofuels. And I think there is a lot to be done from cellulosic grasses to biodiesel to algae. There's a lot of very, very interesting prospects that need to be done. We need to advance on biofuels, not in this way. There's biomass, there's a lot of other forms of biofuels, but we need to think of it without polarizing the issue around these issues. So we need fair trade, sustainable production, improved access for all. And hopefully, out of that, we will be able to go back to that first Millennium Development Objective, which was to abolish hunger. Regretfully, the Millennium Development Goal was cast in 2000 to reduce the number of hungry people from 850 million to 425 million. Instead of which, it has gone up to 950 million and now has crossed the billion mark in terms of people who are chronically malnourished. An enormous gap exists between rich and poor in the countries. I'm not talking about globally, because the movements in China and East Asia have affected the global figures, but within China, within India, within Africa, within Egypt, within 96% of the countries, as reported by UNDP, have had an increase in the gap in income distribution internally, rich and poor countries. Only very few have been able to actually cope with that. So despite global agricultural production, and despite the fact that technically food would be available, in fact, plentiful or not, it is not available. And even in certain parts of the world, we are now facing the specter of a return to starvation with images of that kind. So what can we do in terms of policy that links science, agriculture, and research in order to tackle that issue better? We need to link research into development, as was said in Montpellier. We need to focus on smallholder farmers. They are disproportionately the poor, but they also produce most of the food that is consumed locally. And urban poverty is impacted upon by the capacity of increasing the productivity of the poor farmers. So we need to raise agricultural productivity faster than the reduction in prices, so that the poor farmers can benefit and the poor who buy the food would increase their access. And we need to measure that in terms of total factor productivity. Land, water, labor, energy, and chemical inputs should all be factored in. And if we improve the nutritional content of the food, there could be enormous health benefits. Biofortification is just beginning as a new technique that we are just studying nowadays. Of course, the most famous of these cases was vitamin A rice, and there are others. And we need to also address, beyond that, the vulnerability of many farmers in the developing world. Now, in Egypt, we rely almost entirely on irrigation. But in many parts of the world, people are dependent on rain and rainfall. And that is a problem. In environments such as these, in sub-Saharan Africa, they are totally dependent on rainfall. And rainfall has been erratic, as is variable, but more importantly, over time, there is a reduction in the amount of rainfall, which poses serious problems. So we need to find ways by which extension must bring research to the farmers, to the smallholder farmer, and all should benefit from that result, including the poor in the cities, by lowering the price. And that means we have to transform our extension services. How do you link the research to the actual farmers so the farmers benefit and adopt it? M.S. Swaminathan, who could not be with us today, but is a friend to so many of us, as we're going to celebrate his great partner, the great passing of Norman Borlaug in a special session, he said, Swami said, we are all on this earth as guests of the green plants and those who tend them. And if you reflect briefly just how true that is, you wonder why those who tend the green plants are so low in the totem pole in our developing countries. Yet they are the ones who are making us all live. So agriculture is the key to poverty reduction, to environmental stewardship and food security, and women are the key to food security in agriculture because they play a central role. In sub-Saharan Africa, they produce 80% of the food, they receive 10% of the wages, they own 1% of the land. Small-scale production can be replicated on a massive scale. We saw that in the case of durian and the dairy in India, which now outproduces the United States, mostly by organizing smallholder farmers. Research for the poorest is particularly important, and we haven't focused on that yet, because the poorest do not respond easily to market incentives. There's beautiful economic work done by Partha Dasgupta on that, and that's why trickle-down doesn't work for them, and special outreach programs are needed to reach people who are in this level of dire poverty around the world and who are at risk of being, in fact, going hungry and potentially of starvation. Especially now politically, again, I go back to my earlier statement about peace. We have more internally displaced persons, which the UN euphemistically refers to as IDPs, which kind of takes the edge off of it, but I like to see the picture. I like to see the real human beings behind it. We have tens of millions of people who are displaced in their own countries because of civil strife, if not outright war. As I mentioned a moment ago, gender is extremely important to tackle these kinds of issues. And it is, in the end, practically in every society, the women who build the social capital, who weave together that network of relations that makes a society function. And empowering women is essential to result in major improvements in infant mortality, school enrollments, child morbidity, etc. And women today, in most developing countries, have unequal access to education, healthcare, income, credit, employment, assets, decision-making. Almost every field that you can think of. They suffer from the absence of proper systems of water. They suffer because they have to take to market in non-existing conditions. They suffer because they are the ones who are responsible not only for feeding the children, but also for their education and their future. And it is their solidarity together that keeps many of these parts of the world going and allows the transfer of good values of collaboration where others would see conflict. Now, biotechnology is, of course, one of the most obvious applications of the new biology. And it has a lot of promise, and it's increasingly being applied in very large areas. And if we're thinking of the future challenge to produce more food with less water, less land, less labor, and less chemicals, with an increasing population, how do we deal with this? Well, you can raise the yield ceiling, or you can try to close the yield gap between the current average and the potential that is established in extension stations. And you have to invest in sustaining the current yield, because if you don't constantly invest in research, current yield will drop. And I see Dr. Magdi and Dr. Adel and some of our agricultural scientists on this side who know this cast well, as does Maggie, who chaired the board of a number of CGIAR centers. So we need technologies for increasing the yield potential. Sometimes it comes from different plant types, so-called super rice structures, fewer tillers, more grain. A new plant type can increase significantly the output. This is what we have, 15.2 tons per hectare. Egypt today leads the world in terms of rice output at 8-point-something tons per hectare. We could do much better. We have to understand where the losses come from, whether it's weeds, disease, or insects. We can find ways of fighting bacterial blight with transgenics. Here is an example of how bacterial blight resistance can be tagged with molecular markers, how we can find the resistance genes very effective against that. And this is stem borer damage, and here you see the stem borer larva from the transgenic rice and the stem borer larva from the control rice below, so we can fight pests in non-pesticide using ways.